So, I was travelling home after a long day at work. I'm a paralegal, so on this particular night, I was working late to finalise some details for our client's defence. He was being charged with assault, which was something I'd never personally had to deal with, until that night. I remember I was just sitting there minding my own business in the quiet carriage, when suddenly, a group of boys burst into the carriage. They were being so loud and obnoxious, and seemed to be the type that take pleasure in making people uncomfortable. They were saying crude and inappropriate things, and I felt more and more uneasy with each passing second. The clear ringleader of the group, a boy that had caught my eye earlier on, had a menacing presence, and his friends seemed to follow his every command. He approached me, and started making advances, but I refused to engage with him. His friends started laughing and jeering, and I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. My mind started racing, and I didn't know what to do. I considered calling for help, but I didn't want to make the situation worse. But then, just as I really started to panic, the conductor burst into the carriage, asking passengers to show their tickets. He was a tall, imposing figure, and his presence seemed to quell the chaos. The boys ran off, and I was left alone with the conductor. He asked me if I was okay, and I broke down in tears. I told him about what had happened, and he listened patiently. He offered to stay with me until the next stop, and I was grateful for his kindness. As we waited for the train to pull into the station, I still felt on edge. I kept looking around, half expecting the boys to suddenly reappear, but once the train came to a stop, they were nowhere to be seen. I hurried off the train and walked towards the station exit, and I breathed a sigh of relief knowing that this nightmare was finally over. But just as the train seemed to be pulling out of the station, I saw the same group of boys pry open one of the doors and sprint over in my direction. My heart leapt into my throat, and I started running for my life. It was a long platform, and the station exit was on the opposite end. I was running blindly, and I could hear their footsteps getting closer and closer. I was about to give up, when I noticed a homeless woman with her dog. She was sitting on a bench wrapped in a blanket, and her dog was lying at her feet. I ran towards her, hoping that somehow she would be able to help, and the dog instinctively got up and started barking and snarling at the boys. They immediately backed off, and I managed to escape. Once I was outside of the station, I tried to see if I could get a taxi or Uber, but there were no cars in my area and all of the taxi services were already closed. I was shaking, and my mind was still racing. I realised I had no choice but to wait at the bus stop, and I prayed the next bus wouldn't be too long. I had been sitting there for what felt like hours, when suddenly I saw the familiar headlights of a local bus pierce through the darkness. I felt so relieved, but I was still looking over my shoulder, hoping that those boys didn't suddenly appear. When the bus finally arrived, I rushed on and sat down, feeling exhausted and numb. I was almost holding my breath as I watched the bus doors intently, hoping that nobody else got on. And to my luck, the bus doors closed and it began to move away from the bus stop. Honestly, I've never felt so relieved in my life. Since that day, I've refused to work that late ever again. And to this day, if I ever see a group of teenagers, I can't help but relive that nightmare. This is a story about the worst flight of my entire life. So, it was supposed to be a routine flight, just like any other. I had boarded the plane and taken my seat, ready to settle in for the long journey ahead. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man that was sitting next to me had struck me as odd. He was tall, thin, and had an unnerving smile that never seemed to leave his face. He didn't seem to blink much either, which only added to the unsettling feeling I got whenever I looked in his direction. I tried to ignore him, putting on my headphones and staring out the window as the plane took off. But as the flight progressed, things only got worse. The man started making strange noises like he was whispering to himself, and I could see from the corner of my eye that his gaze seemed to be fixated on me. Nevertheless, I decided to try and get some sleep, hoping that I could just ignore him until we landed. But when I woke up, I found him staring at me with that same creepy smile on his face. I was terrified, but with him being so close to me, I felt trapped. I tried to call for the flight attendant, but my voice caught in my throat. The man started shifting closer to me, and I could feel his breath on my skin. I was too scared to move, too scared to do anything. Then suddenly, the plane hit some turbulence, and it was like a jolt of electricity went through the cabin, and everything started shaking. The man was thrown back into his seat, and I took this opportunity to call over to the nearest flight attendant. I told her about the man and how he had been staring at me and making strange noises. She looked concerned, and the man quickly interrupted and was denying any wrongdoing. I tried to convince her that he was lying and he knew exactly what I was talking about, but he just kept playing dumb. I pleaded with the flight attendant to let me move seats, but she just shook her head and apologized as there were no other seats on the flight. She asked the man to please be respectful of the other passengers and then walked off. We just sat in silence for a while after that. There were still 4 hours left of the flight, which made me feel claustrophobic. I tried to put it out of my mind and hoped that he wouldn't try anything again. But after about 30 minutes of silence, I could feel his breath on my neck again. I turned my head expecting the worst, but then I saw that his eyes were closed and his head was leaning to one side. At first I was relieved to see that he was asleep, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't quite out of the woods yet. I mean, we had over 3 hours left of this flight, and it was only a matter of time before he was awake again. I decided to start a crossword puzzle to pass the time, and this kept me busy for a little while, until I suddenly heard a deep voice and warm breath penetrating my eardrum. "Newspaper." I was in shock, and impulsively shouted, "What?" 14 across, 9 letters. It's newspaper." His mouth was still uncomfortably close to my ear, and I backed away. Can you move away from me, please?" He just stared at me again, but this time there was no smile. He looked angry, like he was about to hit me or something. "I was only trying to help, you moody bitch." At this point, the couple sitting behind me jumped in to my defence. "Oi, don't you call her that!" They then proceeded to shout for a flight attendant, who rushed over. This time, the couple explained that this man had been harassing me all flight, and that he needed to be moved. Again, the flight attendant apologised and repeated the same line about how there were no other seats. But then, to my surprise, the guy sitting behind me offered to swap seats. The flight attendant agreed and asked for the man beside me to move out of his seat. He refused at first. "Why do I have to move? If she wants to move, she can." The flight attendant explained that he needed to move to let me out, but he continued to argue back. Eventually, a few of the other passengers had caught wind of the discussion, and they also came to my defence, demanding that he just move already. The atmosphere in the plane had turned sour, and you could feel the intensity rise, and then abruptly, the man jolted out of his seat and shouted at me to hurry up and move. He was given a warning by the flight attendant and told that if he says one more thing, he will be detained once the plane lands. He tried to talk back at first, but once he realised how serious she was, he eventually agreed to keep his mouth shut. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be rid of him. But as the intensity of the situation started to fall, things suddenly got very real, very fast, as the plane started to shake and rattle, and a strange noise began erupting from the engine. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the plane suddenly dropped. It felt like we were free-falling. People were screaming, and I genuinely felt like I was going to die. The air masks dropped down and the emergency lights came on, but after about 10 seconds of seriously believing that my life was about to end, the plane started levelling out, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. He apologised for the turbulence and told us that everything was going to be okay. We eventually landed safely, and I got off that plane as quickly as I could. I never saw that man again. But to be honest, I was just grateful to be alive. I stepped onto the bus, grateful for the chance to finally sit down and rest after a long day at work. As I squeezed past the other passengers, I noticed a man standing in the aisle, looking directly at me. His eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long, making me feel slightly uncomfortable. I quickly took a seat and pulled out my phone, pretending to be engrossed in something, hoping to avoid any interaction with this stranger that was still staring in my direction. But despite my attempts to ignore him, I could feel him getting closer and closer to me. At first, I thought he was just moving to make room for other passengers. But as more people got off the bus and the crowd started to thin out, the man still stood just inches away from me. I tried to shift away, but there was nowhere else to go. Then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. I noticed that the man had his phone out and he was pointing it at my skirt. The camera lens was directed right at me, and I realised that he was taking pictures without my consent. My heart raced as I realised what was happening. I felt exposed and violated, and I wanted to yell and scream at him about his disgusting behaviour, but I was too afraid. I quickly got off the bus at the next stop and ran as fast as I could, tears streaming down my face. I knew I had to report what had happened, but for some reason I felt silly telling the police, as I had absolutely no evidence, and how were they ever going to find him? For days afterwards, I was filled with a sense of dread and paranoia every time I stepped out of my house. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that the man might be following me. I eventually decided that I had to take action. I went to the police and filed a report, but they told me there wasn't much that they could do unless I had caught the man in the act. I was left feeling hopeless and vulnerable, like there was no justice for me. But then, things took a turn for the worse, as a few days later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a note, along with a series of explicit photos of me that had been taken without my knowledge. The note was filled with lewd comments and threats, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. I decided to take matters into my own hands, and I installed security cameras in my home, and carried pepper spray with me wherever I went. But the fear and anxiety never fully went away. I did show the police the package, but it was untraceable, even after they ran forensic tests to try and find any DNA. From that day on, every time I hear footsteps behind me, or see a stranger on the bus that looks remotely similar to that man, I feel a wave of panic wash over me. Luckily, I am yet to see him again, but I'm not so sure if he can say the same. I remember I was on a school trip to France and we had to take a ferry to get there. I was excited as this was my first time on a ferry, and my friends and I were all chatting and taking pictures, just enjoying the ride. However, something strange caught my attention. There were a group of foreign men on the ferry, and they were taking pictures of some of the girls on our school trip. At first, it seemed harmless, as the girls were tolerating it and even posing for the camera. One of the men even put his arm around one of my female friends and posed with her. But as the ferry ride continued, things started to get even weirder. The men were taking more and more pictures, and they seemed to be getting closer to the girls. They started following them around the ferry, and it was clear that the girls were starting to feel uncomfortable. Then suddenly, we noticed that one of the girls had gone missing. We searched the entire ferry, but we couldn't find her anywhere. We were all worried sick, and the teachers were frantically calling her name over the intercom. Finally, we found her in an empty room, crying in the corner. She refused to talk and kept shaking her head when we asked her what happened. We didn't know what to do, and eventually there was nothing anybody could do, as she wasn't being honest about the situation. The ferry eventually docked in France, and we went on our school trip. But the incident on that ferry had haunted me for months afterwards. I knew something terrible had happened, and I knew the men taking pictures of the girls had something to do with it. It wasn't until a few months later that she finally opened up to me about what had really happened. She told me that one of the men had grabbed her and tried to force her into a room on the ferry. He apparently touched her inappropriately and tried to kiss her, but she had managed to break free and run away and hide. She was too scared to tell anyone at the time, as she was ashamed. I was furious when I heard this, and I demanded that she tell the police. But she was still too embarrassed and didn't want to make a big deal out of it, as it was her fault for tolerating them in the first place. Well, it took a lot of convincing, but eventually I was able to get her to come clean to the police about what had really happened on the ferry that day. The man was eventually caught and brought to justice, but my friend has never been the same since. She used to be so happy and would constantly be doing silly things to make us laugh, but now she's very reserved, and over time we've started seeing less and less of her. To be honest, I haven't spoken to her now for over a year, I think, but I truly hope that she is okay, and that she's been able to overcome that horrible experience. I stumbled on to the subway train, still feeling a little wobbly from the big night of drinking with my friends. It was late and the train was mostly empty, except for a few tired-looking commuters. I was glad to be heading home and settled into a seat near the back of the carriage. But as the train started moving, something felt slightly off. The lights flickered and for a moment the carriage was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, I caught a glimpse of something outside the window. It appeared to have long, spindly arms and a pale face which was pressed firmly up against the glass. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and told myself it was just my drunken mind playing tricks on me. But then I felt the train suddenly speed up, and it was as if I was on a roller coaster. I gripped the edge of my seat, feeling a sense of mounting dread. That's when I saw them. Multiple figures appearing in the darkness outside the carriage. They just looked like people with tattered clothing and faces twisted in agony. They were all pressed up against the windows, with their hands clawing at the glass, as if trying to get in. I called out for help, but no one answered. The other passengers seemed oblivious to what was happening, lost in their own worlds. I was all alone. As the train hurtled forward, I started to feel like I was suffocating. The air was thick and I could barely breathe. And that's when I saw it. A black figure creeping towards me from the other side of the carriage. I wanted to run, to escape the terror that was closing in around me, but my body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if I was stuck in a nightmare. The figure drew closer, and I felt like I was going to be consumed by the darkness. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for my brutal end. But when I opened them up again, I was no longer on the train. Instead, I was lying on a bench in the subway station. A homeless man was standing over me, knocking my head with a plastic cup and asking for spare change. I fumbled in my pockets, giving him all the change I had, and then I scrambled to my feet and rushed off, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt like a dream, but the memory of those ghostly figures was burned into my mind. Even now, as I sit in the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that what I experienced was all too real. Now, this isn't the first time that somebody has had a paranormal experience on the New York subway, and I'm sure it won't be the last. But next time I go out drinking, I think I will probably just get an Uber. Thank you for watching, and if you prefer the longer format videos, please let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe for more scary stories.